Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. People like to remember the late 1960s in London as loud and colorful. Music in the streets, new ideas, long hair and late nights. That is how it looks in photos, at least. What they do not show you is the fear. Not the big kind of fear you read about in history books. This was smaller, quieter. It lived in side streets and empty train cars. It came out after sunset and followed people home. By the time most of the city had heard the name Highgate Vampire. The fear was already there. The papers only gave it a shape. I remember the first headline I saw. It was folded on a bench near the bus stop, half soaked from rain. The word vampire was printed so large it almost looked like a joke. First, I thought it was one. London papers had a habit of chasing strange stories when things were slow. But then I noticed how many people were standing still, reading it. No one laughed. No one smiled. They just read, shook their heads, and walked on faster than before. Within weeks, everyone had a version of the story. A tall figure, red eyes, a dark shape moving between graves. Children said animals were found drained of blood. Adults said they heard footsteps behind them at night but never saw anyone there. Some swore they saw something standing on the old walls of Highgate Cemetery, watching the road below like it was waiting for someone. Soon, the fear turned into noise. Men started showing up at the cemetery gates after dark. Some carried wooden stakes. Some had crosses. A few brought cameras, hoping to catch proof. They called themselves hunters, but most of them looked scared. They shouted at shadows and jumped at the sound of their own steps. Police tried to keep them out, but Highgate was old, and old places have more ways in than people expect. The papers loved it. Every night brought a new story. Every morning brought another headline. The vampire became a kind of local legend almost overnight. People argued about whether it was real, whether it was a prank, or whether it was mass panic. Some said it was all nonsense. Others said the city had always had dark things hiding under it, and this was just one of them showing its face. What most people do not remember is how fast the story burned out. After a few months, the hunters stopped coming. The police stopped talking. The papers found something else to print. London moved on the way it always does. If you ask someone about the Highgate Vampire now, they might laugh. They might say it was just a silly scare from another time. That is the version everyone knows. It is not the version I remember. While the city was busy watching men chase ghosts through the trees, something else was happening quietly, out of sight. No crowds, no cameras, no shouting, just stone, silence, and a grave that should never have been opened. I did not go to Highgate looking for a vampire. I did not believe in them then, and I do not believe in them now. I was there because it was my job, because someone had to keep track of the old places once the shouting stopped. Someone had to notice what the noise covered up. Highgate Cemetery is not like other cemeteries. It is older than it looks, and it remembers things. The paths twist in ways that make no sense unless you have walked them enough times to stop trying to understand. The trees grow too close to the graves, their roots pressing against stone like fingers. Even during the day, the light does not reach everywhere. Some places stay dim no matter how bright the sun is. At night, it feels smaller, closer, like the dark is leaning in. During the height of the panic, I stayed away from the main paths. The hunters ruined enough stones without help, but there were areas they never reached. Old sections without famous names. Graves that were no longer visited. Places too quiet to be interesting. That is where I spent my time. It was during one of those evenings, when the shouting had moved elsewhere, that I noticed something wrong. Not broken, not damaged in the way people expect, just wrong in a way that made my skin tighten without knowing why. There was a tomb I had passed many times before. It did not stand out. No large statue, no carved angel, just a stone structure set back from the path, partly hidden by ivy. If you were not looking for it, you would miss it completely. That night, I stopped in front of it for reasons I still cannot explain. The air felt colder there. Not the kind of cold you feel on your skin, but the kind you notice in your chest when you breathe. The stone looked darker than the rest, even though it was the same color. And there was a feeling, faint but steady, that the space around it was not empty in the way other graves were empty. I told myself it was nerves. Everyone was nervous then. The city had been fed fear for weeks, and fear does not leave quickly. I made a note to come back during the day and moved on. Behind me, the city talked about vampires. Ahead of me, something waited. At the time, I did not know what it was. I only knew that while London chased a story that made noise, the real one stayed quiet. And quiet stories, I learned later, are the ones you should listen to most. This is not a story about a vampire. This is the story of an empty grave, and how it did not become empty on its own. I should explain why I was even allowed to be in Highgate when all of that was happening. People like to imagine that cemeteries are watched closely, that every stone and path is guarded. The truth is very different. Even back then, especially back then, Highgate was mostly left to itself. Too large, too old, too quiet to matter unless something went wrong in a way people could see. I was not a guard, and I was not a caretaker in the way most people picture one. I did not carry keys that opened every gate, and I did not walk the grounds with a whistle or a torch at night. My work was slower than that, quieter. I helped with records, old burial logs, plot maps that no longer matched the ground they described, notes written in ink that had faded so badly you had to tilt the page just right to read them. Some days I worked indoors, sitting at a desk that smelled like dust and paper, copying names and dates into newer books so they would not be lost. Other days, I was sent out to walk sections of the cemetery and check on older plots. Not repairs, not cleaning, just checks. Was the stone still standing? Was the door still sealed? Had anything shifted that should not have? It sounds dull, and most of the time it was. That is why they trusted me with it. Highgate has graves no one visits anymore. Entire rows belong to families that faded out of London generations ago. No flowers, no letters, no fresh footprints, just stone markers slowly sinking into the ground, leaning closer to one another every year like tired men sharing a secret. Those graves still mattered. Not for memory, maybe, but for order. When a stone falls or a tomb cracks, it becomes a problem later. A safety issue, a question. And questions were the last thing anyone wanted during the panic. When the vampire stories broke out, the cemetery became a stage. The front sections filled with people who had never cared about graves before. They leaned over gates, pointed at monuments, and whispered like the dead could hear them. Police stayed near the entrances, trying to keep things calm. But calm was already gone, so they sent people like me away from the noise. That I was told to stay in the older sections, far from the main paths. Just keep an eye on things, they said. Write it down if you see damage. That's all. They did not say what kind of damage they expected. They did not need to. I knew what vandalism looked like. Everyone did. Broken crosses, smashed stone, graffiti carved by people who wanted proof they had been there. You could always tell when a grave had been attacked from the outside. The marks told a clear story. Force, panic, carelessness. What I did not know, then, was what it looked like when something left. The unnamed tomb had always been on my list, though I did not realize it at first. It appeared in the old maps as a blank space with a box drawn around it. No label, no family line, just measurements and a note that said sealed. Sealed was not unusual. Many tombs were sealed once and never touched again. But even those had names, dates, something to anchor them to the people who built them. This one had nothing. The first time I checked it during the panic, everything seemed fine. The stone door was shut. The seams were tight. No cracks. No sign of tampering. I made a mark in my notebook and moved on. The second time, a few weeks later, I felt uneasy standing there, but I blamed the stories. Fear has a way of sinking into places without being invited. The tomb was quiet, the way all graves are quiet, but there was a weight to it that I could not explain. Like the air pressed down a little harder right in front of it. Again, I found nothing wrong. It was the third time that stayed with me. By then, the vampire hunters had mostly moved on. The papers were losing interest. The city had decided it was embarrassed and wanted to forget. Highgate felt empty again, but not peaceful. There was a sense that something had been disturbed and not put back the right way. I approached the tomb near the end of my shift, when the light was starting to fade. I remember thinking I should come back the next day, that checking stones in low light was a bad habit. But I was already there, and the list was long. At first, I thought the door was playing tricks on my eyes. Stone changes color as the light shifts. Shadows stretch. Straight lines bend if you stare too long. Then I stepped closer. The door was not open. Not fully, but it was not sitting the way it should have been. The seam along one side was wider than before, just enough to slip a finger into. I did not touch it. I did not need to. Stone doors like that are heavy. They do not move on their own. My first thought was vandalism. It had to be. Someone must have forced it, then lost their nerve and run. That made sense. It was the kind of sense people lean on when they do not want to look deeper. But the more I looked, the less that answer worked. There were no chips along the outer edge where tools would have struck. No scratch marks. No broken stone scattered on the ground in front of the tomb. The ivy was still clinging to the sides, undisturbed, its vines uncut and unpooled. I circled the structure slowly, listening to the sound of my own steps on gravel. Everything was intact. Everything except the door. When I crouched to look closer, I noticed the hinges. They were bent. Not inward, like something had been pushed in. Outward, away from the tomb, as if pressure had been applied from inside, steady and patient, until metal that had not moved in decades finally gave way. I remember sitting back on my heels and feeling a coldness settle into my hands. It was not fear yet, not fully. It was confusion, sharp and unpleasant, like realizing you have been reading a sentence wrong and only just noticed. People break into graves for reasons I do not want to understand. But no one breaks out of one. I wrote everything down that night. The time, the light, the state of the stone. I used careful words, neutral ones. I did not mention how my chest felt tight or how the air seemed thicker around the tomb. Records are not meant for feelings. Before I left, I stood there longer than I should have. I told myself I was just being thorough, that I was doing my job properly. But the truth is, part of me was waiting for a sound, a shift, anything that would explain what I was seeing without forcing me to accept the other option. Nothing happened. The tomb stayed silent. The door stayed slightly open, and the space behind it felt deeper than it should have been, like a mouth held just wide enough to breathe. When I finally turned away, I had the strange thought that I was not leaving it behind, that I was being allowed to go. After that evening, I tried to convince myself the problem would solve itself. Someone higher up would notice my report. A supervisor would come out, take one look at the door, and order it sealed properly. There would be a reason. There was always a reason. Old stone shifts. Metal weakens. Time does strange things when no one is watching. That is what I told myself while I waited. Days passed. Nothing happened. No crew arrived. No notices were posted. No mention was made of the tomb at all. When I asked, carefully, whether anyone had followed up on the report from the lower west section, I was met with blank looks. One man flipped through a folder, shrugged and said, "If it's not marked urgent, it can wait." So it waited. And so did I. I began checking the tomb every day, though I did not write that part down. Officially, I was following my normal route. Unofficially, my steps bent toward that quiet corner no matter where I started. I told myself I was just being careful, that once something is damaged, it should be watched closely. That was reasonable. That was responsible. Still, each time I approached it, I felt the same tightening in my chest, like I was stepping into a space that had not been meant for me. The tomb sat where it always had, half hidden by ivy and shadow. The stones around it were old but ordinary, leaning at slight angles, their names worn smooth by rain. Some had dates so faded they looked unfinished. Others had cracks filled with dirt and moss, the ground slowly claiming them back. This tomb was different. It did not lean. It did not sink. It sat square and level, like it had been set down yesterday instead of decades ago. The stone was dark, but not from age. It was clean in a way that made the surrounding graves look neglected by comparison. And there were no names. That was what troubled me most. Most family tombs, even the smallest ones, announce themselves. A surname carved deep into the stone. A crest. A date marking the first burial. Even when time wears the letters down, something remains. A curve. A shadow. A trace of intention. This one had nothing at all. No carving. No plaque. No symbol I could point to and say, this belonged to someone once. The front face was bare stone, unmarked except for hairline cracks that ran like veins through the surface. It was as if the tomb had been built and then deliberately stripped of identity. I checked the records again, more carefully this time. The plot maps showed a structure in that location, but the space where a name should have been was blank. No ink, no crossed out letters, just an empty line. The burial log listed it as occupied, sealed, and paid for in full. Paid for by whom was not recorded. At first, I assumed the missing information was the result of poor record keeping. Highgate's archives were full of gaps. Fires, floods, careless hands. Whole years were missing from some sections. It was not unusual to find a name that appeared once and never again. But the more I looked, the stranger it became. The tomb did not belong to any of the nearby plots. It was not part of a family line. There were no notes tying it to an estate or a church. No mention of a caretaker. It existed in the records the way a shadow exists on a wall. Clearly there, but attached to nothing solid. I asked one of the older workers about it. He frowned when I described the location. Did not ask for the plot number. Did not ask for a map. He just shook his head slowly and said, "That one again." I asked him what he meant. He told me he did not like that section. Said the ground there never settled right. Said stones stayed standing longer than they should. When I pressed him, asked if he knew anything specific about the tomb, he grew quiet. "Best not to bother with it," he said finally. "Some graves are meant to be left alone." That was not an answer, and we both knew it. Each day, the door remained the same. Not open enough to enter. Not closed enough to ignore. The gap along the seam looked darker as the light changed, like a thin line cut into the stone. When the sun hit it just right, I could see into the space beyond, though only barely. There was nothing visible inside, just darkness. I noticed other things, too, once I started paying attention. Birds did not land on the tomb. They perched on nearby stones, hopped along the ground, but avoided the roof entirely. Ivy grew up the sides but stopped short of the door, as if something about the stone there repelled it. Even insects seemed scarce in the narrow space in front of it. None of this would have mattered on its own. Cemeteries are full of small oddities. You learn to accept them if you spend enough time among the dead. But taken together, they formed a pattern I could not ignore. One afternoon, while standing there longer than I should have, I became aware of how quiet it was. Not the normal quiet of a cemetery, where distant traffic hums and birds call from the trees. This was deeper, heavier, like the sound had been pressed flat. I held my breath without meaning to. For a moment, I thought I heard something from inside the tomb. Not a voice, not a movement, just a faint pressure change, the way your ears feel when you move between rooms too quickly. Then it passed, leaving behind a sharp sense of having been noticed. I stepped back, heart racing, and felt foolish immediately after. The vampire stories had gotten to me, I told myself. Anyone would feel uneasy standing in front of a damaged grave. That did not mean anything was wrong. Still, I did not turn my back on it until I reached the path. That night, I dreamed of stone. I dreamed of a door that opened inward, not outward, and of a space behind it that went on much longer than it should have. I woke with the image still clear in my mind, the sense that the dream had not ended when I opened my eyes. The next morning, I returned earlier than usual. The door had moved. Not much, just enough to be sure. The gap was wider now, the darkness inside deeper and more complete. The hinges were strained further, metal bent into a shape it had never been meant to take. The lock, which had been damaged but intact before, now hung loose, snapped clean through. I stood there for a long time, notebook forgotten at my side. Whatever had caused this was not careless. It was not rushed. It was not the work of people acting on fear or rumor. There was a patience to it that unsettled me more than any sudden act ever could. I knew then that I would have to look inside. Not because I wanted to, because whatever had opened that door had already decided that someone would. I waited longer than I should have before going inside. Not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because some part of me still hoped someone else would take the choice away from me. That a supervisor would appear, or a notice would be posted, or the door would be sealed again before I had to cross that line. None of that happened. By the third morning after I noticed the lock had snapped, the tomb had become impossible to ignore. It sat in my thoughts even when I was far from it. I would be copying names from one book to another and suddenly realize I had written the same date 3 times in a row. I would pause in the middle of a sentence, aware of nothing except the image of that narrow gap in the stone that I told myself I would only look. Just enough to confirm what I already suspected. Just enough to write a proper report that could not be dismissed. That was the lie I needed to tell. I chose a time when the cemetery was quiet but not empty. Late morning, when the light was strong and honest, when shadows had fewer places to hide. I brought no tools, no torch, no camera, only my notebook, which felt thin and useless in my hand. The walk there felt longer than usual. Every sound seemed sharper. Gravel under my shoes, wind in the trees, the distant noise of the city pressing against the walls. I was aware of my own breathing in a way I had never been before, as if my body was preparing for something my mind had not accepted yet. When the tomb came into view, my first thought was that it looked exactly the same. My second thought was that it did not. The door was still ajar, but now I could see the full damage clearly. The stone around the hinges was cracked, not shattered, but strained. The metal had not been torn free violently. It had been bent, slowly and repeatedly, until it no longer held. I knelt to look closer, tracing the damage with my eyes. Every mark told the same story. Pressure from the inside. If someone had tried to break in, there would have been chips along the outer edge of the door where tools struck. There would have been cracks spreading outward from a central point of impact. There would have been loose stones scattered on the ground in front. There was none of that. Instead, the cracks curved away from the interior of the tomb. The door frame bowed outward, subtle but unmistakable. Even the lock had failed in a way that suggested it had been pushed, not pulled. The metal had stretched before it snapped, like it had been tested again and again until it finally gave up. I sat back and felt a cold heaviness settle into my stomach. People do not open tombs this way. People do not have the patience. I placed my hand against the stone beside the door, steadying myself. It was colder than the air around it, as if it had been holding onto the night longer than it should have. For a moment, I wondered if I would feel something move on the other side. I did not. The darkness inside the tomb was thick, the kind that does not thin right away when light touches it. It seemed to absorb what little reached past the doorway, refusing to give anything back. I leaned closer, peering in, my eyes straining to make sense of the space. At first, all I saw was shadow. Then my vision adjusted, and the shape of the interior began to take form. The tomb was larger than I expected. Not wide, but deep, extending farther back than the outer structure suggested. The walls were smooth stone, carefully fitted, with none of the roughness you see in older graves. Everything about it felt deliberate, planned. The floor was clear. That was the first detail that truly unsettled me. Most tombs show signs of age inside. Dust settles. Debris falls from the ceiling. Small stones collect in corners. This floor was bare. The stone worn smooth as if something heavy had stood there for a long time and then been removed. I took a step inside before I realized what I was doing. The air changed immediately. It was cooler but not stale. There was no smell of rot, no dampness. None of the things you expect when you step into a place sealed for decades. It smelled like stone and nothing else. Clean in a way that felt wrong. I stopped just inside the doorway, every sense alert. The silence inside the tomb was complete. No echo, no distant sound from outside. Even my breathing seemed muted, as if the space was pressing in around it. When I looked down, I saw the coffin. It sat against the far wall, plain and undecorated, made of dark wood reinforced with metal bands. It was not broken. It had not been smashed or forced apart. The lid rested beside it, placed carefully on the floor. That detail mattered. Graves that are disturbed from the outside show chaos. Splintered wood, torn lining, scattered remains. This coffin looked like it had been opened with care. The way someone opens something they expect to use again. I approached it slowly, each step measured. The inside was empty. Not just empty of a body, empty of everything. No bones, no cloth, no lining, not even the faint outline left behind when something has rested in one place for a long time. The wood inside was worn smooth, as if it had been rubbed clean. I stared at it longer than I cared to admit, my mind struggling to fill in the missing shape. Buried bodies leave traces. Even after many years, something remains. A stain, a fragment, dust that settles into a pattern. This coffin held nothing that suggested it had ever carried a person at all. It was as if it had been waiting. A sound reached me then, faint but sharp enough to cut through my thoughts. The scrape of stone against stone. I froze, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing followed. I became painfully aware of where I was standing. Alone, inside a tomb that should not have been open, in front of a coffin that should not have been empty. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest, making each breath an effort. I backed away slowly, careful not to turn my back on the coffin until I reached the doorway. The light outside seemed too bright, almost harsh, when I stepped back into it. I sucked in a breath like I had been underwater. I did not close the door. I could not. As I stood there, shaking slightly despite myself, one thought repeated over and over in my mind. This place had not been broken into. It had been left, and whatever had left it had taken the time to do so properly. I did not write my report right away. That might sound careless, but it was the opposite. I knew that once I put the words on paper, they would exist in a way I could not take back. Reports have a way of fixing things in place. They turn strange moments into official facts, and once that happens, people start asking questions you may not be ready to answer. So instead, I walked out. I left the tomb and followed the narrow paths through the older sections of Highgate, letting my feet carry me where they wanted. I passed stones I had seen hundreds of times before and barely noticed them. My thoughts stayed behind me, locked inside that dark space I had just stepped out of. The coffin was empty. That simple fact kept repeating in my head, steady and calm, like it was trying to wear something down. Empty was not the right word, though. Empty suggests absence, lack. This felt different. It felt prepared. I stopped near a bench and sat down, notebook still closed in my hand. The city sounds crept back in slowly. A bus engine in the distance, voices drifting over the wall. Life going on as usual, unaware that anything had changed. I wondered how many people had walked past that tomb over the years without knowing what it held, or what it was meant to hold. How many times it had been checked, marked as sealed, and forgotten again. How long it had waited. When my breathing finally steadied, I forced myself to think clearly. There had to be an answer that did not involve fear or stories. A body removed quietly, records lost, an old mistake discovered too late. These things happened. They had to. I went back to the office and pulled every file I could find related to that section. I spread maps across the desk and lined up logs from different years, looking for anything that did not match. I checked nearby graves, tracing family lines, hoping to find a connection that would explain the tomb's silence. There was nothing. The tomb existed alone, and no burial order listed its opening. No note marked a transfer. No record showed anyone had ever been allowed inside after it was sealed. It was as if the coffin had been placed there, the door closed, and then the world had agreed to stop paying attention. That should not have been possible. I stayed late that night, long after the others had gone home. The office felt different without voices and footsteps to fill it. The lamps cast small circles of light that left the corners in shadow. Each time the building settled or the wind pressed against the windows, I looked up, half expecting someone to be there. I told myself I was being foolish. But when I finally closed the last book and stood up, I felt the same pressure in my chest that I had felt inside the tomb. Something was missing. Not from the records from the ground. The next day, I returned to the tomb with more care. I brought measuring tools this time. A small lamp, gloves, all the things I told myself would make this a proper inspection instead of what it really was. I stood outside for a long time before going in again. The door had not moved since the day before. The gap was the same, the darkness inside unchanged. If anything, it looked deeper now, as if the light was more reluctant to enter. I stepped inside slowly, letting my eyes adjust. The cold air wrapped around me again, steady and quiet. I took note of the walls, the ceiling, the joints between stones. Everything was solid. No hidden exits. No signs of collapse. Then I knelt by the coffin, up close. The emptiness was worse. The inside was too clean. Not polished, but worn smooth, like the stone floor. The wood showed faint marks along the sides, long and shallow, as if something had rested there and shifted over time. Not the way a body settles, but the way something that is not quite at rest might move. That I traced one of the marks with my gloved finger and felt a faint groove beneath the surface. I pulled my hand back quickly. The thought came to me then, uninvited and sharp. What if it had never been dead? I stood and took a step back, shaking my head. That was the kind of thinking that led to panic and headlines. I forced myself to stay grounded, to think like a man surrounded by stone and paper, not stories. That I checked the floor carefully, near the center of the tomb. There were faint scuffs on the stone, shallow but clear if you knew where to look. They did not lead to the door in a straight line. They curved, slightly, like something had stood there and turned before leaving. There were no footprints and no drag marks, just pressure marks, pressed into the stone over time. But I straightened slowly, the weight of the space settling over me again. If something had been taken from this tomb, it had not been taken recently. It had been here long enough to leave a mark. That night, I could not sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the coffin open and waiting. I thought of the way the door had been pushed outward, not broken, of the care with which the lid had been set aside, of the patience written into every mark left behind. This was not an escape. It was a release. In the early hours of the morning, I sat up in bed with the sudden, clear sense that I was thinking about the wrong thing. The question was not why the grave was empty. The question was why it had been filled in the first place. That I went back again the following day, even though a part of me knew I should not. The air felt different as I approached, heavier, like a storm about to break. I stopped short when I saw something new. The door was wider open, only by a little, enough to notice, enough to know it had moved since the last time I was there. That I did not go inside right away. That I stood there, staring at the widening gap, and felt a slow, cold understanding take hold. The tomb was not finished with me. Whatever had left had not gone far, and the empty space it left behind was not meant to stay empty for long. By the time I realized the tomb was changing on its own, the city had already decided on a different story. That was the part that still unsettles me the most when I think back on it. Not the empty coffin, not the bent hinges, not even the way the door kept opening wider without help. What stays with me is how easily everyone accepted the wrong answer, and how quickly that answer spread until it covered everything else. The Highgate Vampire. It was a perfect story. Simple, loud, old enough to feel familiar, but strange enough to be exciting. A monster with rules, a face people could imagine, something that could be hunted, named, and argued about over pints. And most importantly, it was a story that kept people looking in the wrong direction. Every time the papers ran another piece about glowing eyes or drained animals, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because no one was asking about damaged tombs in the older sections. Dread because I knew how easily attention could turn, and how little it would take for someone to start asking the wrong kind of questions. The hunters came back for a short while after one particularly dramatic article. They clustered near the front gates again, waving crosses and flashlights, daring the dark to answer them. Some shouted challenges into the trees. Others filmed the shadows, convinced they were catching something just out of view. They never came near the unnamed tomb. Not once. I watched them from a distance on my way to work, their voices echoing through the cemetery like children playing a game they did not fully understand. They searched for movement, for something that would jump or run or bare its teeth. What they did not understand was that whatever had opened that grave did not move that way. It did not rush. It did not hide. It waited. I tried to speak to someone about the damage again, choosing my words carefully. I mentioned the door, the hinges, the fact that it was not vandalism. I did not mention the coffin. I did not mention the marks inside. The response was always the same. A tired sigh, a distracted nod. Probably those vampire lot, someone would say, stirring things up again. Once, I pointed out that the damage did not match forced entry, that it looked like pressure from the inside. The man I was speaking to laughed, not unkindly, and told me I had been spending too much time alone among the graves. "You start seeing things," he said. "It happens." That was the moment I understood how complete the lie had become. The vampire story was not just a rumor anymore. It was an answer, convenient one. It explained everything without requiring anyone to look too closely. Broken stones? Hunters? Strange sounds? Imagination? Open graves? Pranks.it wrapped the truth in something familiar and set it aside that I began to notice other things once I started paying attention. Reports came in of gates found open that had been locked the night before. Not broken, just open. Dogs refused to enter certain paths, pulling against their leads and whining until their owners turned back. A groundskeeper claimed he heard footsteps pacing slowly behind him late one evening, only to turn and find the path empty. These reports were laughed off or quietly ignored. "Everyone's on edge," people said. "It's that vampire nonsense." I wondered how many strange things had been buried under stories like that over the years. How often fear had been used to explain away something that did not want to be explained at all. The tomb door continued to open. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It never swung wide or crashed against the stone. Each day, the gap grew a little larger, as if something was testing how much space it needed. Measuring, adjusting. I stopped measuring it myself. I did not need numbers anymore. I could see the change with my own eyes. One afternoon, I noticed faint marks on the ground just outside the doorway. Not footprints, not tracks, just areas where the gravel had been pressed down harder than the rest. Like someone had stood there for a long time without moving. I stood in those marks and felt a chill run through me. From that position, you could see the main path. You could watch people walk by without being seen. The idea made my mouth go dry. That evening, as I was leaving, I passed a group of young men at the gates, laughing and talking loudly about the vampire. One of them asked me if I had seen anything strange working there. I looked at his excited face, at the way his eyes searched mine, hoping for a story that would scare him just enough to be fun. I told him no. Not because I wanted to protect him, because I did not know how to explain the truth in a way he would hear. The lie of the vampire had already done its work. It had turned fear into entertainment and sealed it off from reality. As long as people were chasing a monster with rules and a name, they would not notice the quieter thing moving through their blind spots. That night, I dreamed again. This time, there was no coffin. There was only the space it had left behind, stretching wider than the tomb itself, opening into something that felt too large to be held by stone. I woke with the sense that the dream had not come from me at all. The next morning, the tomb door was fully open, and for the first time since this began, I understood that whatever had been released was no longer bound to that place. The vampire was a lie, and lies, I was learning, are sometimes built to keep something far worse from being seen. Once the door stood fully open, I stopped pretending this was a problem that would solve itself. I also stopped pretending the answers would be found in the ground alone. If the tomb had been built for a reason, that reason would be written down somewhere. Even if the record was hidden, changed, or damaged, something would remain. People forget, but paper remembers. Even when it is told not to. So I went back to the records again. Not just the ones I had already checked, but everything I could reach without asking permission. Highgate's archives were not kept in one neat place. They were spread across rooms and cabinets, some in use, some half forgotten. Boxes stacked on shelves, ledgers wrapped in cloth, folders with no labels at all. The air in those rooms was thick with dust and age, and the silence felt different from the cemetery outside. Heavier, closer. I started with the oldest burial logs. Not the ones meant for visitors or researchers, but the working books. The ones used by men who expected no one else to read their notes. Their handwriting was rough, sometimes rushed, sometimes careful in a way that suggested worry. Margins were filled with comments that had nothing to do with dates or names. Do not move. Leave sealed. Check stone yearly. Those notes appeared again and again, always near the same few plot numbers. I followed them like a trail. The unnamed tomb appeared more often than I expected, but never directly. It was referenced by position, by measurements, by nearby markers. As if the writers did not want to name it even when they could have. In one book, I found a page that had been torn out. Not cleanly, ripped. The pages before and after it were intact, their numbers still printed at the bottom. Someone had removed a single sheet and left the rest, hoping no one would notice that I noticed in another ledger. A name appeared in faint ink, written lightly enough that it was easy to miss. It was crossed out so many times the paper had thinned beneath it. The letters were no longer readable, just a dark blur where a name had once been. Next to it was a short note. Incorrect classification. No explanation. No correction. Just that. I began to understand what I was looking at. This was not a missing record. It was a changed one. I compared dates across different books and found small shifts. A burial listed a week later in one ledger than another. A sealing date moved by a month. Tiny differences that meant nothing on their own, but together suggested someone had gone back and adjusted the timeline. Not to erase the tomb.to blur it.as I worked, a strange pattern emerged. The tomb did not appear in records during the years you would expect. It surfaced briefly, then vanished again, only to reappear decades later with the same notes repeated in a different hand. Do not open. Do not relocate. Leave as is. The handwriting changed. The warning did not. At one point, I found a thin folder tucked behind a cabinet, its edges curled and soft with age. There was no label on it. Inside were loose sheets, some typed, some handwritten, some clearly copied from older sources. One page stopped me cold. It was a sketch. Not a drawing of the tomb itself, but of its interior. The measurements matched what I had seen. The depth, the placement of the coffin, the thickness of the walls. Written beneath it, in careful letters, was a single sentence. Containment structure, temporary. Temporary. I read the word again and again, my mouth dry. Containment meant holding something in place, keeping it from moving, keeping it from spreading. It did not mean burial. It did not mean rest. It meant delay. There was no author's name on the page, no date, but the paper was old. Older than the official opening of that section of the cemetery. Older than some of the stones that surrounded the tomb. Now I looked up suddenly, struck by the feeling that I was not alone. The archive room was empty, but the silence pressed close, the way it had inside the tomb. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and steady in my ears. I gathered the papers carefully and returned them to the folder, sliding it back where I had found it. I did not take anything with me. I did not want to explain why I had it if I was stopped. I did not want to answer questions I could not yet ask myself. As I left the building, the sky outside had darkened. Clouds hung low, heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. The cemetery paths were empty, the gates already locked for the evening. I stood there for a long moment, looking toward the section where the unnamed tomb waited. Containment structures fail eventually. That is their nature. They are built with the understanding that time will win, that whatever is being held will outlast the walls meant to restrain it. The people who built that tomb knew this. That was the part that frightened me most. They had not built it to last forever. They had built it to buy time, and standing there in the quiet, with the vampire story echoing faintly in the city beyond the walls, I realized something else the records would not say. The tomb had not been forgotten. It had been watched. And now, for reasons I could not yet understand, whoever had been watching it had decided to look away. I did not plan to speak to anyone about what I had found in the records. In truth, I had already learned how that would go. Questions were brushed aside. Warnings were softened into jokes. Anything that did not fit the vampire story was treated like a mistake, or worse, like weakness. People do not like being told that the thing they are laughing at is not the real danger. But the cemetery has its own way of deciding when secrets should surface. I ran into him by accident. He was standing near the outer wall of the older section, where the trees grow close and the ground stays damp even in dry weather. I had seen him before, though never for long. He was older than most of the staff, thin and bent, with hands that shook slightly even when he was still. People said he had worked at Highgate longer than anyone else still alive. Some said he had worked there longer than the cemetery had been open in its current form. I do not know if that was true. I only know that when I saw him that morning, he was watching the unnamed tomb from a distance, his eyes fixed on it like he was waiting for it to move. I stopped a few steps away, unsure whether to speak. He noticed me immediately. "You went inside?" He said. It was not a question. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had told no one. I had written nothing official. There was no way for him to know unless he had seen me or guessed. How do you? I started. You don't break a rule like that quietly, he said. Not in that place. He finally turned to face me. His eyes were clear, sharp in a way that did not match the rest of him. He looked tired but not confused. If anything, he looked resigned. You shouldn't have gone in, he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. But it doesn't matter now. I asked him what he knew. He laughed softly at that, a sound with no humor in it. Knew, he said. I know what I was told. Same as the men before me. Same as the men before them. He began walking, slow but steady, and I followed without thinking. We moved along a narrow path that curved away from the main grounds toward an area few visitors ever reached. That tomb isn't a grave, he said after a while. Not really. I waited, afraid that if I interrupted him, he would stop. It was built to hold something, he continued. Something that didn't fit anywhere else. Something that didn't stay the way it was meant to. My mouth felt dry. Was it a person? I asked. He stopped walking. For a long moment, he did not look at me. He stared at the ground, at the roots breaking through the soil, twisting around old stone. It wore a person once, he said finally. That was the problem. He told me that the tomb had emptied before. Not recently, not even in his lifetime, but it had happened, quietly, without panic, without stories. Each time, the door was found open the same way. Each time, the coffin was empty. And each time, he said, they closed it again. I asked him who they were. He shook his head. Doesn't matter. They're gone now. He explained that the tomb was never meant to keep what was inside forever, only to slow it down, to keep it from the city while people figured out what to do next. But no one ever figures it out, he said. They just hope the stone holds. I told him the door was fully open now. He nodded, as if he had expected that. That means it's done waiting, he said. The calm way he spoke those words frightened me more than anything else I had seen so far. I asked him why no one had told the police, the council, anyone. Because once you give it a name, you make it smaller, he said. And it doesn't like being made small. He spat on the ground, a sharp, final gesture. The vampire story was useful, he went on. People needed something simple, something loud, something they could chase away with sticks and faith. Keeps them from noticing the quiet parts. We had reached a small clearing now, one I had never seen before. From there, you could see the unnamed tomb clearly through the trees, its dark shape standing apart from everything around it. The door will close again, he said. It always does. That should have comforted me. It did not. Then why are you worried? I asked. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw fear there at last. Because it doesn't close right away, he said, and because it never goes back in. He told me that after the last time it emptied, there were changes, small ones at first. People reported feeling watched. Doors left unlocked were found open in the morning. Places that should have felt safe felt wrong instead. Nothing anyone could prove. Nothing anyone could stop. How long does it take? I asked quietly. He shrugged. Longer than you want. Shorter than you think. When we returned to the main path, he stopped walking. I won't be here much longer, he said. I've done my part. I asked him what my part was. He smiled sadly. To remember, he said, and to stay out of its way. That was the last conversation I ever had with him. A week later, I was told he had resigned. No notice, no explanation. His name disappeared from the staff lists like it had never been there at all. But his warning stayed with me. That night, as I lay awake listening to the city breathe beyond my window, I realized something else he had not said out loud. The tomb was not empty because something had escaped. It was empty because it had finished resting, and whatever it had been waiting for had finally arrived. After the man left, the cemetery felt different. Not quieter, not darker, just aware. I tried to convince myself that feeling would fade, the way fear usually does once the source is gone. But this fear did not come from what I had seen or heard. Came from what had changed. From the sense that something had shifted its attention outward, away from stone and records and into the open spaces where people moved without thinking. I avoided the unnamed tomb for 3 days. That was the longest I managed. I told myself I was respecting the warning, that staying away was the smart thing to do. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that open doorway. Every time I passed through the older sections on my rounds, my body angled toward it before I could stop myself. On the 4th evening, the sky turned the color it does just before rain, low and heavy, pressing down on the city. The grounds emptied earlier than usual. Visitors hurried out. Gates closed. Locks slid into place with dull final sounds that echoed longer than they should have. I stayed. I did not tell anyone. I did not sign anything. I simply did not leave when the others did. By the time I stepped onto the path that led toward the tomb, the cemetery belonged to no one but itself. Night in Highgate is not sudden. It arrives slowly, pooling in low places, stretching shadows across stone until shapes blur and lose their edges. The air cools in stages. The sounds thin out one by one. I walked without a torch. I wanted to see the place the way it had been meant to be seen. As I moved deeper into the older section, I became aware of something I had not noticed before. The usual night sounds were missing. No birds settling, no insects calling. Even the distant hum of traffic felt muted, as if the walls were thicker than they had been earlier that day. It felt like standing inside a held breath. The tomb came into view gradually, its dark outline separating itself from the surrounding graves. From a distance, it looked unchanged, solid, closed, ordinary. That illusion did not last. The door was open. Not just ajar, not just wide. Open. The stone slab rested against the outer wall, leaned carefully to one side. It had not fallen. It had been placed. The ivy around it was bent but not torn, parted just enough to make room. I stopped walking. Every instinct I had told me to turn around, to leave while I still could. But there was something else there too, something quieter and more dangerous than fear. Recognition. I had the clear, sudden sense that this moment had already happened once before. Not to me, but to someone else standing where I stood now, watching the same doorway open onto the same darkness. I forced myself to move. Each step felt deliberate, like crossing a line drawn just for me. The ground near the tomb was disturbed now, the gravel pressed flat in wide patches. Not footprints, no clear pattern, just signs of repeated pressure, as if something had stood there many times, waiting. I reached the threshold and stopped. The darkness inside the tomb was different at night. During the day, light fought its way in, thinning the shadows just enough to reveal stone and shape. Now the darkness felt active, layered, like it had depth and weight of its own. I stepped inside. The air was colder than before, not sharply cold, but deep, settling into my bones. My breath fogged faintly, though the night outside was not that cold. The coffin was still there, empty, but the space around it had changed. The floor markings were clearer now, more defined. The shallow scuffs I had noticed before had deepened, pressed into the stone with purpose. They formed a loose circle near the center of the tomb, like a place someone returned to again and again. The walls bore new marks as well, long, faint lines near the back, almost hidden unless you knew where to look. Not scratches, more like impressions, as if something had leaned there repeatedly, testing the boundary. I felt a tightness in my chest, the same pressure I had felt before, only stronger now. I was not alone. I did not hear anything at first. No footsteps, no breath, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears, loud and uneven. Then I sensed movement, not behind me. Above. I looked up too quickly and felt dizzy for a moment. The ceiling was intact, solid stone. Nothing hung from it, nothing moved, and yet the feeling remained, like a tension. I backed away slowly, careful not to trip, my eyes never leaving the interior of the tomb. As I reached the doorway, something shifted behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned. The cemetery path behind me was empty, but the space felt occupied. The air there was thicker, darker, as if the night itself had gathered into a shape that did not need edges to exist. I could not see it clearly. I do not think I was meant to. What I felt instead was intent. It was not angry. It was not curious. It was patient. The same patience written into the bent hinges and the careful placement of stone. The same patience that had worn marks into the coffin and the floor over years, maybe decades. It had been waiting for night that I took another step back, my heel catching on the threshold, and the pressure in the air increased. My ears rang softly, like standing too close to something large and quiet. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the feeling eased, the air loosened. The space behind me felt empty again. That I stood there shaking, afraid to move, afraid not to. When I finally gathered the courage to look back into the tomb, I saw that nothing had changed. The coffin was still empty. The marks were still there. The door was still open. But I understood something then that I had not before. The tomb was no longer the center of this. It was a place that had been used. And now it was only a reference point. That I left the cemetery as quietly as I could, locking nothing, touching nothing. As I passed through the older sections, I felt eyes on me that were not there, attention sliding away as I moved, already searching for something else. When I reached the gate and stepped out into the street, the city noise rushed back all at once. Cars, voices, light spilling from windows, people moving without fear or awareness. That I stood there for a long time, watching them, because I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever had left that tomb was no longer bound to the dead. It was learning the paths of the living. And somewhere behind me, in the dark, the empty grave waited, its work finished. I never wanted to return to that tomb at night again. I thought I had seen enough. I thought the empty coffin, the bent hinges, the way the door opened on its own, had shown me all there was to know. That I was wrong. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. The city forgot about the vampire story almost entirely. Headlines faded. Tourists stopped coming to peer over the gates. Highgate itself seemed to sigh, settling into its usual rhythm of silence, bird calls, and the occasional visitor who didn't notice the older sections at all. But I could not forget that I could not leave it alone. Even during the day, my eyes were drawn to that corner of the cemetery. I found myself walking toward it under the pretense of work, checking stones, making notes, performing tasks that should have felt normal but never did. I could not explain why. It was as if the tomb had left a kind of mark on me, a faint pull I did not notice until I stepped toward it instinctively. And then, one morning, I arrived to find something I could not have prepared for. The door was closed, not slightly ajar, not leaning. Fully closed, perfectly flush with the surrounding stone. No gap, no crack. It could have been mistaken for any other tomb if I had not been staring at it every day for months. My first reaction was relief. A small, foolish hope that the attention, the waiting, the presence had finally left. I dared a laugh, thinking the pressure in my chest would ease. It did not. I approached cautiously. Something was different. The air was heavier. I could feel it in my lungs, pressing down. The space around the tomb seemed darker, colder. The way stone holds temperature, but not from sun or shade. It held intent. I reached out, lightly touching the cold surface of the door. It shifted under my fingers, just slightly, like it was aware of me. I stepped back. And then I understood. This was not a door. It was not even a boundary. It was a presence. It was something that could wait, that could observe, that could test the living. For months it had been patient, shaping my routine, studying me as I studied it. I had walked its paths without realizing I was part of the pattern. The realization left me hollowed. I sat on the ground, my back against a nearby tree, staring at the tomb, waiting for nothing, listening for everything. I felt it then. Not in sight, not in sound, but in the very air around me. A subtle shift, like a breath on the back of my neck. My hair stood on end. I did not turn. I did not need to. It was close. And I knew somehow that it had been there every time I had been inside. Watching, measuring, learning. The coffin had been empty because it had always intended to be. It had not been taking. It had been training, preparing, waiting. The city went on around me, oblivious. Children's laughter rang faintly from the streets beyond the walls. Cars hummed. Someone dropped a newspaper, its pages rattling in the wind. Life continued. Everything that should have been ordinary and safe. I had spent months walking among the dead, believing the stories, believing the records, believing even my own senses. and yet I was the one being studied. Time passed. Hours, maybe. I did not keep track. The tomb never moved. Not visibly, but the presence was undeniable. I could feel it pressing just beyond comprehension, waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Finally, I stood, slowly. My legs were stiff. My mind raced, thinking of what I should do, what I should tell someone, how I could explain what I had seen. But I could not. There were no words for this. Not yet. Perhaps never. I walked the paths away from the tomb, carefully. The feeling followed me in subtle waves, brushing against me like a shadow that could slip in and out of existence at will. I glanced back once. The door remained closed. Nothing appeared different, but I knew better. I always knew better now. That night, I could not sleep. Every sound was heightened. Every shadow felt alive. Every corner of my apartment seemed too small, too bright, too loud. And through it all, the thought kept returning. It had left the tomb, but the tomb had not left me. Over the following weeks, I noticed things in the city. Small things, odd glances in the streets, shadows that paused a beat longer than they should, doors left open when no one had been there. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but the pull never left. The tomb had opened, and something from it was now aware, and it had learned me. I returned once more to the cemetery, months after that final night. The path was overgrown where I had walked, but the tomb was the same, closed, perfect, waiting. I touched the stone again. The cold burned my fingers. It did not resist. It did not welcome. It simply existed. And then I understood something I could not have admitted before. The tomb had chosen me, not as a victim, not as a witness, not even as a caretaker. It had chosen me as part of its story. The coffin inside was empty. The door was closed. And yet, I have never been the same since. I can walk past the tomb now without seeing it. I can close my eyes and hear the city outside. I can tell myself that life continues, that the vampire story was a lie, that nothing happened to me that could not be explained, but I know the truth. The tomb is not a grave. It is a marker. A teacher, and a reminder that some things in this city are not meant to be understood. Some things wait quietly, perfectly patient, for the right person to notice, and I am still noticing, even now, even here, as I speak these words to you. Highgate is full of secrets, some buried, some forgotten, some, like the unnamed tomb, waiting to be recognized. And when they are truly seen, they leave a mark that nothing can erase. I do not know what will come next. I do not know if the tomb will open again. I do not know if I am meant to leave this story behind, or if the story has already claimed me in a way I cannot undo. All I know is this: the grave is empty, and yet it is not gone. It never will be. It waits, and I will always see it.